That's promising. So it's with great pleasure that we get introduced at Keynote this afternoon, Professor Nicola Clayton, and thank you for coming. I know there's delays and all sorts. Now, I'm not going to say too much, but it's interesting that, so obviously Professor Nicola Clayton is now Professor at University of Cambridge, but she originally got her PhD here, I believe, right? So it's nice to be back.
Thank you, yeah, very nice to be back.
Now, she's obviously made huge contributions to, massive contributions, largely to the field of cognitive biology and comparative cognition and biology. And of course, this has been recognized now as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2010. So we're very, very pleased to have you here. And I will say that you were nominated and voted for by the students of the school. This was no lecture input or higher level input. This was all the students that voted for you. So it's not quite as prestigious as a fellowship award, but hopefully you can take
Absolutely. Very honoured. Thank you.
So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Right. I'll do my best with this. I'm going to stick fairly close to here, simply so for practical reasons I can put that on there, because these microphones aren't really designed for people like me that prefer to just wear dresses. All right, so ways of thinking from Corvids to children and back again. What I thought I'd like to do today is to tell you about some of the experiments that we've been doing on the evolution and development of cognition in a variety of species of corvids, or members of the crow family, including the Eurasian jay pictured there on your left, and also some of the work that we've been doing on the development of cognition in young children. Most of the work will be on children based somewhere between about 2 and maximum 10 years of age, and I'll point out the age is for the relevant studies in due course. And what I want to argue really is that corvids are extremely intelligent, and in fact they're passing tasks that in some cases children don't pass till really quite late in development. What I'm not trying to say is that because a corvid passes a test that a child of 4 passes and a child of 3 fails. What I am not saying is that a corvid is like a 4-year-old child. They're not. For all kinds of reasons, a trivial one being a difference between fur and feathers, amongst all kinds of other things, including educational practices. But I am interested in comparing them because in many of the cases we're dealing with the development in young children before language has fully come online, and in animals where language in the sense of reading and writing never comes online. And I'm interested in looking at some of the cognitive milestones, and the view is to try to develop tasks that I can look at both and then look at the ways in which they're solving the task to see whether they're doing them in the same way or different ways. And I suspect the answer is going to be a combination of same and different, and it's going to be the precise pattern of similarities and differences that's going to be informative. I want to base my argument around 3 key lines of evidence, and the first that I'm going to consider is social cognition. And to do so with the corvids, I'm going to focus on caching behaviour, and I want to begin with one species in particular, the western scrub jay. And this is what the behaviour looks like in our laboratory. That's a western scrub jay called Sweetie Pie, and these are waxworms, the Belgian truffles of the scrub jay world, and that's caching behaviour. The bird hides the food by a burial. And the advantage of having little ice cube trays filled with a sand substrate to cache in is that we can have little CCTV cameras at the top of the cage, and then we can watch from the video monitoring room precisely what the bird is caching where and when. The reason I developed these ice cube trays to do this is that in the very first experiments, before I had a team of people to help me do it, I had to run these experiments on my own. And I'm not very good when it comes to navigational space. So I needed to have a system that I could use that would allow me to encode where the birds were hiding the food. And I figured that if I had something like a tray, I could just have left and right, 1 to 7 or 1 to 8 or whatever, and I could record it in a non-spatial way. So that's why it's such a simple system. Not that the bird's spatial memory is no good, but mine isn't. In fact, these birds don't only hide their own stashes of food, they also steal other individuals' stashes of food, both within the species and between species, and they go to great lengths to protect their caches from being stolen by other individuals. And it's thought that that's particularly important in the case of the crows because they have what's called observational spatial memory, and this means that potential pilferers can just watch where other birds have cached, wait until those birds have left, and then they can come back at leisure and steal the caches based on their memory of where they saw the other birds steal them. And we found that they do indeed use a number of cache protection tactics. They degrade information by preferentially caching in the shade when others are watching, whereas they cache equally in sunny and shady sites if they cache in private. They remove information by caching behind barriers if others are watching, something they don't show a preference for when they cache in private. They degrade information using distance, so they cache further away if others are watching. They conceal auditory information when others can hear but cannot see. And they can even keep track of which particular individual bird was watching when they cached in a particular caching tray and that individual's knowledge site. Did they see them or not? So those are a bunch of examples of the cache protection strategies that these birds use. But the one I want to focus on today is actually one of the first caching experiments that Nathan Emery, my husband, and I ran way back in 2001. And in this condition, we had the bird doing 2 caching episodes, one of which was observed by another bird and the other was in private. So they either cached whilst observed and then cached in private, or the other way round. And then 3 hours later, they got to recover their caches in private when no other birds were around. And the question was, would the jays rehide the worms that the observer had seen? So in this case, the ones in the purple tray, that would be the observed tray. The brown tray was the one cached in private. And what we found was that indeed that is the case for experienced thieves. They moved the caches that had been observed and specifically into new places, which, because recovery is always in private, by definition is a place that the potential thieves don't know about because they're not there to witness the recaching. And the striking result is that not all birds do this. It's only those that have been thieves in the past. Naive birds who haven't had the opportunity to steal the birds' caches don't show this recaching behaviour. And Nathan Emery and I inferred that this could be a kind of experience projection. The idea would be that the cacher recalls its previous experience of being a thief and predicts the observer's potential pilfering behaviour, reasoning by analogy with its own experience. So it's the putting yourself in someone else's shoes, so to speak. It takes a thief to know a thief, a type of theory of mind. Now, this behaviour isn't trivial because when we test children, they struggle. And here's one little example. So this is in fact based on a Tansen O'Neill's paradigm. And as you can see from the little video clip, the child there's a sticker that the child wants. He can't reach it. He asks mummy to give it to him. And the 2 conditions that were run in the original Tansen O'Neill experiment were one where either mummy could see or mummy had her eyes covered during the baiting of the sticker. And the idea was that if mummy can see which cup the sticker's been placed into, then the child will just instruct mum, go get it. Whereas if mummy's eyes are covered when the sticker is being placed in the container, then when she reopens her eyes, the child needs to point or give mummy some information about which container it's in. And what Tansen O'Neill found was, sure enough, the children would spontaneously point when mummy's eyes had been covered during the baiting of the sticker. What we wanted to do was to replicate the experiment, but in addition add in 2 artificial conditions of seeing and not seeing. Because most young children will have had many experiences of peekaboo games of this form and others in which mummy's eyes are either covered or uncovered. And of course we know that there's something very salient about simply being able to see a pair of eyes. So in order to control for that, in our artificial conditions, mummy wore some swimming goggles that had these funky shapes on the outside. And one pair of the goggles mummy can see through. You can't tell from the outside which she can see through, but mummy can see through one of them and not through the other. And in this particular condition, it's the blue ones that mummy can see through. Needless to say, for half the conditions, it was the yellow ones that mummy could see through. And the idea is that mummy wears these goggles, and then the question is, will they say, go get it in the seeing condition and point in the not seeing condition? In addition, we ask the children whether or not mummy can see. So we have two measures. We have the can mummy see, yes, no, and then we have the does the child spontaneously point to the container. In our first experiment, the children had first-hand experience of wearing the goggles. So they would put the goggles on and they would say things like, it's dark, or es ist dunkel, when Christoph was testing some German children, indicating that they understood that those were the not seeing ones, and then the other ones they'd say it was bright, or I can see through it, or whatever. And then the question was, could they use their first-hand experience of being able to see through one pair of glasses and not see through the other pair of glasses to correctly infer whether or not mummy can see and whether or not they need to point at the container. So here are the results. The dark-coloured ones are the replication of the natural conditions of a Tansen O'Neill, so seeing or not seeing, and the grey are the transparent glasses that you can see through, or the opaque ones that you can't see through. So what you see is that the children pass the can mummy see question correctly. If mummy's eyes are open or she's wearing the glasses you can see through, they say yes. If her eyes are covered or she's wearing the glasses you can't see through, they say no. We replicated the Tansen O'Neill pointing thing. They're much more likely to point to the container when mummy's eyes are covered than when they're open. But when they can't see mummy's eyes, even though they've been able to say whether or not correctly answer the question, can mummy see, in both cases they point, and there's no difference between the two conditions, suggesting that when we give these artificial manipulations, they don't get the pointing question correct. So in this first experiment, they get the can mummy see question correct, if you like, and the pointing question wrong. And of course, if they were able to do this experience projection and understand that seeing leads to knowing, they should get both questions correct. In the second experiment, different children, because if you ask the same children to do it, they simply usually repeat the answers that they gave you last time round. In our second experiment, what we did was we gave the children no experience of wearing the glasses, but this time they got the opportunity to witness mummy behaving with the glasses on. So in the condition when mummy can't see, wearing the opaque goggles, she fumbles about in a handbag and she's clumsy and she knocks things over and she can't find the things, and she behaves in all the ways that somebody that's got glasses on that can't see through behaves. And in the other condition, when she can see through, she can get her keys out of her handbag and stack boxes and do all the coordinated things that normal mummies with normal vision can do. And then we did exactly the same thing. We asked them, based on mummy's behaviour, can mummy see? And then played the little game to see whether or not they point. Now this time round, again, it's no problem in the two natural conditions, they behave normally, but in the artificial conditions, now we find that they fail the can mummy see question. They don't show a big difference based on mummy's behaviour as to whether she's able to see or unable to see, and there's no difference between the two conditions. But it's not that they've not paid any attention to mummy's behaviour in these two conditions, because when mummy behaved as if she could see because she was wearing the glasses that she can see through, they don't bother to point. When mummy behaves as if she can't see because she's got these glasses on that she can't see through and is clumsy, they do indeed point. So you can think of it as this is the opposite dissociation from experiment one. In experiment one, they pass the can mummy see and fail the pointing. In experiment two, they fail the can when we see question, but they still spontaneously point, suggesting that they only have partial access to an understanding of seeing leads to knowing. And a simple way of explaining it would be in terms of how engaged or disengaged mummy is, as opposed to making any inferences about how, to what extent seeing leads to knowing and not seeing leads to not knowing. So that's my first example. The second one, there are many examples of physical cognition in these birds, and here are a few of the classic examples that have been done on New Caledonian crows and also on rooks, which interestingly, although they don't habitually use tools in the wild, if you give them a problem in the lab where a tool would be helpful in order to reach a reward that they couldn't otherwise reach, they will happily use tools. Here are some examples: the bending of a piece of wire to make a hook-shaped thing to retrieve a bucket, selecting the appropriate length or type of tool, and here adding stones to use water as a tool in order to get a food reward that's out of reach, and using one tool to get another tool is a further example. And there's a lovely clip, if you're interested in the what I call tools on tools, using one tool to get another tool to get food, that we put a little clip of one of the New Caledonian crows, which we named 007, onto YouTube, and it does an 8-stage planning task. The example I'm going to focus on is the water tube or Aesop's fable task that was first developed by Chris Bird and Nathan Emery on rooks. And here's one of our jays. This is Romero doing the task. And you notice that the quality of the movie clips and lighting and everything is significantly better than the other ones that I showed you. This is because the BBC film crew shot this for us. That's why it looks so pretty. So that's the basic task. What the bird has to do is to learn to drop stones into a tube. And this is the way they get trained or learn to do it. So in our training task, we have a tube, no water to be seen anywhere, but it has a platform base to it, which has a magnet on it, such that if you drop something, a stone or a pencil or an apple core or anything like that into it, it unleashes the magnet. The straw sort of slides down and the food comes out the bottom. So the idea is that all we're trying to do here is to get them used to the idea that tubes are a good thing because they're usually associated with a food reward, a worm, and that what they're being trained to do is drop stones into a tube in order to get food. Having learned to drop stones into tubes to get food, we then gave them the experiments. Now we have a tube and stones and a worm, but now the worm is on the top, not the bottom, and there's water in the tube. And in the first experiment, we contrasted water with something else. So we either have water versus wood chip, so liquid versus solid, or water versus air, where our worm is miraculously floating on top of the tube thanks to a bit of blue tack, because sadly I'm no real magician. And what you can see here is the overall pattern of results. So this is the order in which the stones are inserted on the y-axis, and then it goes across trials. And basically, for the stone into a water tube versus a wood chip tool, birds that learn the task are the ones that you see increasing amounts of blue, because it's the water tube you want to see them inserting the stone in. And in the water versus the empty tube or full of air, obviously it's more blue you want to see. And what we can see here is that of our 4 birds, we find 2 of them are able to learn this task, Hoy and Romero. The other 2, Wiggins and Ainley, didn't. And in fact, Wiggins stopped adding stones to the tube, so it's very difficult to conclude much about that. The second experiment, which is the more interesting one in many ways, in this one, now we just have a single tube full of water, but now rather than varying the substrate in the tube, we're varying the tools. So here they have ones that sink and ones that float. And you can see that initially they try both, but pretty rapidly they learn that it's the sinkable ones that do the job. And eventually Romero removes the offending inappropriate item so that he can get his worms. And in the real experiment, that was the pretty version for the BBC. In the real version, it was rubber and foam. And you see that both Hoy and Romero rapidly learned this task. So we then tested children. And here's our version for the kids. And the idea now, obviously, having a worm floating on the top, I'm not sure we'd even get that past ethical review, never mind anything else. So we have a very simple little sticker that floats, which they can then exchange for a badge or another big sticker, which they really like. And there she's got a little sticker which she knows. So this is just showing that they have no problem doing this task. And so then we looked at what happened with water versus sawdust, and these are children from the age of 4 to 10. And you can see that in the younger children, there seems to be some learning going on. They get better across trials, whereas from 8 onwards, they're spontaneously able to do this very successfully from the beginning. But the second experiment is more interesting. This is the behaviour of a 6-year-old. And you don't seem to quite get the plot, really. If it doesn't work, just hit it, chuck it. And he wasn't too impressed, I have to say. This is a 9-year-old doing it. So this is what the results look like. And you can see that actually, it's, again, there's some learning going on between sort of the age of 5 and 7. They do get better over trials. But it's not really until they're 8 that they're able to spontaneously pass this task. I was very surprised by how late the children were at developing these skills, and I'll come back to that later on. But I will say that Jackie Chappell and Ian Appley and Sarah Beck's lab have been looking at young children doing the wire bending task that Betty the New Caledonian Crow so famously did, and then Nathan's Rooks did as well. And again, children have great difficulty figuring out that you need to bend the piece of wire into a hook to retrieve a bucket until they're about 8. They can do it very easily if they see somebody else do it, but if they're tested in the similar conditions to the birds in which they're tested individually without seeing others, it develops quite late. So it's not just our work that's showing this late development. So my third example is planning ahead. And I thought I'd begin to explain this experiment by showing you a short clip from Inside the Animal Mind.
But is this just another example of instinctive behaviour to survive the winter? Or is there something far more complex going on? It's a question that's greatly intrigued Professor Nicola Clayton. She studies western scrub jays, another American corvid, renowned for its caching behaviour. Nikki wanted to discover whether they could do more than just remember where they buried food in the past.
If they can travel back in their mind's eye to think about the past, can they also travel forward in the mind's eye to think about the future? Can they imagine the future, if you like? Can they plan ahead?
To find out, Nikki created an experiment based on a very human annoyance: waking up to find that breakfast is off the menu. For 6 days, the birds were housed in this aviary, split into 3 zones. In the middle is the dining room, where the birds were fed during the day, and at either end are the bedrooms, where they were kept at night. But there's a twist. Kept overnight in this bedroom, the birds were served an early breakfast. But kept overnight in this one, they got no breakfast and went hungry until mid-morning. The birds experienced this daily routine for almost a week.
So we give them 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the hungry room and 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the room that serves breakfast. But the important point is that the birds themselves didn't know which room they'd end up in on any given day.
But then Nikki changed the test. She allowed the birds to cache food in the evening before bedtime. She placed caching trays in both the hungry and breakfast rooms. The question was, where would they choose to store the food? Nikki wanted to know if the birds could use their past experience of the 2 different rooms and plan for the future, namely for breakfast time tomorrow. The results left no doubt.
What we found is that the birds cache about 5 times as much in the hungry room as they cache in the breakfast room. They can imagine what they're going to need the following morning when they wake up hungry, so they can solve a problem before it's even happened. So what this experiment shows is that the birds can plan for the future.
So the jay's caching behaviour is far more than mere instinct. They have a grasp of the past, but can also anticipate future need and, crucially, plan for it. This skill is very rare in the animal kingdom, and it's the 4th key ability needed to solve problems.
It's called mental time travel.
There you go. That's what the results really look like in terms of the number in the hungry and the breakfast room. Now recently we've run a similar experiment on young children. We haven't done it with foods, but with toys, and that way we can avoid any problems with worms or nut allergies or anything else. So we have a room that serves toys in the morning that they can play with, and a boring old room that doesn't have toys in the morning, so there's nothing for them to do. And then they get the option of, in the evening, having a basket of toys, and where do they want to put them. So you have a toy room and a no toy room, and then you can, where would you like to put these toys? And of course the correct answer is in the big birds room, because there's plenty of toys in the other room. And what we find is that only the 4 and 5-year-olds are able to plan for the future. So when they're given the decision that you're doing it for your next birthday, it's only the 4 and 5-year-olds that are significantly above chance. But it's not that the 3-year-olds can't do it, because if you ask them to do it in the present for right now, the 3-year-olds are also able to do it. So it's not that they don't understand anything about the test, but as with a number of other studies on developmental cognition, and particularly in the realm of mental time travel, it's only when children reach 4 years of age that they start being able to project themselves in time. And quite often, if there's a dissociation between having to understand what you would want for the future and someone else just like you would want for the future, they may not even develop those tasks until they're 5. So it develops quite late. So my interim conclusion from crows to children and back again. So I've presented 3 sources of evidence, some work on social cognition. I've presented some work on physical cognition and some work on future planning, showing that in each case, these things develop quite late in development in young children. And I suppose one of the things that I found initially quite surprising about this is that if you'd asked me to predict before I'd done the tests which tasks the children would find the easiest, I would have assumed it was the physical cognition, that children don't pass tests of theory of mind and mental time travel until they're about 4 is consistent with a lot of the literature that's already out there on these sorts of things. But that the physical cognition develops so much later, I think is quite interesting. And I wonder why that is. And I wonder whether, in part, it says something about the effects of technological enculturation, because I think these days, I mean, we all have these things, right? And I honestly don't know how it works, really. I just know how to turn it on and off. I have no idea. And if it breaks, you know, I just go to the iPhone store and ask them to sort it out for me. So I think there's a sense in which young children, you know, if they get the social side of things wrong, they're going to be ridiculed by their friends. Certainly when I was growing up, I know it's horrible to people that seemed a bit daft socially. But I think with the physical, we can kind of afford to not know how they work. So I wonder whether it would be quite interesting to do some cultural studies comparing performance in mechanicized societies like ours and other places where they're perhaps not constantly wielding iPhones all the time. And I was particularly interested because I watched one of the TED Talks by Gerva Tully, and it had a wonderfully provocative title, 5 Dangerous Things You Should Let Your Kids Do. I thought that was fantastic. And basically it was arguing that by not letting children sort of make things and play outdoors as much these days, they're perhaps losing some of the technological skills. And it made me think of Brainovsky's famous phrase that the hand is the cutting edge of the mind, and just thinking that perhaps it's the fact that we are so used to gadgets now that the young children aren't thinking through those physical tests in quite the same way, because intuitively to me they seem very simple tasks. I was quite surprised. So further investigation is needed, I think, to understand, you know, why the children are passing those tasks at such late. And of course the other conclusion is that the Corvids' ability to do these tasks is not only far from trivial, but I find it quite interesting that the jays and the rooks that aren't natural tool users are perfectly able to solve these tool problems in the lab. And that's quite exciting because, of course, the criticism always levied on me about the food caching paradigm. You know, you say, oh, well, you're showing what amazing cognitive skills they have. But surely they've been adapted over millions of years because caching is something they do for a living in the lab. Of course, they're going to be good at caching-related tasks. So it's quite interesting that they're also good at these physical tasks that they haven't been doing for generations and generations. They're not habitual tool users. But what else might it show? Well, of course, one of the things that Nathan and I have argued is that when it comes to cognitive abilities, there's also been a convergent evolution of these abilities in very distantly related groups. For example, within the Corvids and within the non-human and human apes. And one of the reasons that this might be is because of what Humphrey called the social function of intellect hypothesis, and 10 years before him the late Alison Jolly said similar things. And he argued that the higher intellectual faculties of primates have evolved as an adaptation to the complexities of social living. For better or worse, styles of thinking which are primarily suited to social problem solving colour the behaviour in man and other primates, even towards the inanimate world. And we've argued that this could also apply to other species that also have complex social structures, of which corvids could be one, parrots could be another, dolphins could be another, and so on and so forth. And we've changed the term slightly, rather than social function of intellect, to social relationship intelligence, in the light of work by a number of people, but Dunbar and Robin Dunbar and Suzanne Schultz in particular, suggesting that monogamy might also be a key factor in this. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Here are some parallels between the chimpanzee politics in the famous Franz de Waal book and the idea of parliament of rooks. And the idea basically is that these, in both cases, they form these long-term positive affiliations or alliances, and they maintain relationships in various ways. If you're an ape, by grooming. If you're a bird, by preening. They also both engage in active food sharing, more about that anon. And also you see active support during and after fights. And you also see kissing in the apes. And of course birds can't kiss, they don't have lips. What do? They do bill twining, but if you look at it close up, it looks a bit like French kissing. There's some serious tongue action going on there, I tell you. And they can be extremely synchronous, hopefully long-term pairs mimic one another. And in terms of social relationship, Nathan found this wonderful cartoon by Randy Glassberg, and when you've been married a long time, you get to know what the other person thinks. No, you don't, he says. So there you go. So what we were interested in doing was using this food sharing behaviour to ask whether the jays could attribute desire states to their females. Now, I'm using this terminology in a very particular way that comes from learning theory. So, you know, desire state is little one, same as knowledge with a little k, not a big K. But the idea here is that I can capitalise on specific satiety. So if you've just eaten a lot of one food and you were given the choice of more of that food and something different, once you're sated on a particular food, it's specific, which means that you will eat some of the other food. So in our experiments, and this applies across the board to just about every species that's been tested, and what we were interested in is if the male jay in the breeding season, who's readily motivated to share food to his female, if he sees her eat a particular food to satiety, will he then be able to give her the food that she wants, independent of his motivational state? So if he's just seen her eat lots of mealworms, will he be able to infer from watching her eat them that having eaten loads of mealworms, she's not going to want any more mealworms, but she is going to want some waxworms, and vice versa. If she's just eaten lots of waxworms, now she'll want mealworms. Now I was going to try and play you a little clip of what it looks like, and then I'll go through the proper experiment. So this is the idea of the what the food sharing test looks like. So the male sits at the food sharing window, and he's offered two foods. And then he can choose one of the two foods to feed to his female. And there he's taken a waxworm, and then the male shares the food with the female. So that's what it looks like. And the reason we did it with jays and not rooks, most of these birds share food. Courtship feeding is hardly an unusual thing. But the big advantage with the jays is, as you can see, they're very delicate in the way they share. And what that means is we can see precisely which food item they've transferred to the female and how many. The problem in the rooks is they take a big beakful and mush it all up, and then all you see is goop. So you can see if stuff is being transferred, but you can't say what's being transferred and how much. Because the jays are so delicate in their food sharing behaviour, this allows us to actually quantify which types of food and how many items are shared. So that's the basic protocol. So in the specific satiety experiment, first of all, the birds are pre-fed one of two foods, either mealworms or waxworms. And then in the test phase, they're given a choice. And this is just to ensure that we've got our specific satiety paradigm up and working, because obviously if this doesn't work, then the rest of the experiment is mute. So this is just the sort of baseline. So the idea is, I'm full of waxworms, so I think I'll eat the mealworms, or I'm full of mealworms, and so I think I'll eat the waxworms. And we find, yeah, sure enough, this is the average difference in the proportion of waxworms eaten in the specific satiety experiment. So they're much more likely to eat waxworms if they've been pre-fed mealworms than if they've been pre-fed worms. And we do it as a different score because the individual birds vary so much in how many items they will take. So it ranges from, a bird that's full after 5 waxworms and a bird that's wasn't full even after 150, and at that point to stop because waxworms are so expensive. So now in the proper experiment, here we have 2 conditions, seen versus unseen. So in the experimental condition, the male sees the female eating either the mealworms or the waxworms, and then he's given the choice phase, and can he infer if she's eaten lots of waxworms, it's mealworms she'll want, and if she's eaten lots of waxworms, if she's eaten lots of mealworms, it's waxworms she'll want. And in the unseen condition, there's a barrier put up such that the male can't see what the female's eating. So the idea is that if he can infer from what she's seen, then he should be able to do this in the seen condition, but not in the unseen condition. If, on the other hand, he's responding to the behavioural cues that the female's giving off, so maybe, having eaten lots of waxworm, she looks at the waxworm bowl and kind of turns her head in disgust and looks really keen on the mealworms. If he's simply responding to behavioural cues she's giving off, then he should be able to do it in both the seen and the unseen condition. So here's the seen condition. Yes, he can do it. So he's much more likely to give her waxworms if she's been pre-fed mealworms than the other way around. And in the unseen condition, there's no difference. So if she is giving off any behavioural cues, they're not helping him know what to give her. Then in the final experiment, we said, well, could it be that having seen her eat particular food, just seeing her eat that just makes him want the other food? Is he actually doing it for what he wants as opposed to what she wants? Well, if that's the case, if we rerun our specific satiety condition, but now he simply sees her eat food rather than he eats the food himself, and then he gets the option to eat the food. If simply seeing her eat the food makes him say, ugh, had enough of that, I want food too, then we should see a difference based on what he's seen her eat. So if she's full of waxworms, but she's gone, what do I fancy now? Do I go for the waxworms anyway, or would I put off the waxworms having seen her eat them? And here we see no effect of observational specific satiety. There's no difference in his choice of waxworms or mealworms based on what she's seen. And just to show you the difference, whereas there's a big difference in the specific satiety. So that's the food sharing. And we've now done a version of this with children as well. And these are children of the age of 4 to 6. Obviously, we don't give them worms. Instead, they see a protagonist either eating crackers or apples during the pre-feeding stage. And then during the test phase, so once they've seen the protagonist finished eating the dinner in the baseline condition, or the apples or the crackers, they get told that you will get to choose what they want to eat next. And you get a little box for you and a little box for the protagonist. And the little box for you just means it helps that the children don't have to inhibit their own desire to want the foods. And what we see here is that 4 and 5-year-old children can't do this. They don't discriminate between a protagonist sated on apples from one sated on crackers. It's only at the age of 6 that they understand that the one sated on crackers wants apples and the one sated on apples wants crackers. So it's comparable to the Jays only at age 6. But we ran a second condition, the told and seen condition, in which rather than just observing and having to make an inference based on what you've seen the other person eat, in this condition, having eaten the food, the protagonist gives them feedback, tells them explicitly what I want. So having eaten crackers, the little boy says, I'd like apples, and points to the apples. And the one that's eaten crackers says, that's eaten apples, points to the crackers and say, I'd like crackers. And when we run that condition, we see that even 4-year-olds are able to do the task. So it's not that they can't do it when they're given direct instructions. It's not that they don't want to play the game and help the protagonist. It's that it seems that they need the explicit, this is what I want. They can't just infer it, unlike the Jays. And that just shows you the two conditions. So if they're told and seen, all children pass. If they only see it, it's only the 6-year-olds that pass. So to wrap up, one reason why I think this is particularly interesting is this notion of convergent evolution. And it's particularly interesting, I think, given the divergence. It's over 300 million years ago that they shared a common ancestor. And certainly in terms of neuroarchitectural structure, the corvid brain, the bird brain in general, is very different to that of humans and non-human apes and mammals in general, in fact, because of course the mammalian brain has a 6-layered prefrontal cortex and the corvid brain has much more of a nucleated structure, although I do find it interesting that increasingly studies are suggesting that despite these differences in architecture, there are more and more similarities than we thought between the overall organisation of the bird and the mammalian brain. So that's just my analogy. You can think of them as being made of the same thing. In my analogy, it's cake mix rather than neurons and glia, and the bird brain with its nucleated structure is more like a fruit cake, and the mammalian brain with its 6-layered structure is more like one of those Austrian Sachertorte chocolate cakes. So I'll just finish with saying I wish I could claim that these ideas were new, but sadly the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher thought of this in the 1800s. He said if men had wings and bore black feathers, few of them would be clever enough to be crows. So with that I'll finish. I'd like to thank all my collaborators, Nathan Emery, Christina Etance, Tony Dickinson, and all the members of my lab. I'd also like to thank my birds and the funding agencies with whom none of this would be possible. And I'd also like to thank you, all of you, for listening and for you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Very interesting. I'm sure there's thousands of questions. There's thousands of you. And start from the front.
So in the experiment, when you were looking at the feeding, when the males couldn't see what the females want,
Yeah.
and so they potentially either choose correctly or incorrectly.
Yeah.
On the second visit back, do they then change their behavior to choose correctly if they chose incorrectly the first time?
They don't get a second visit back, so it's just a single choice. But it's quite an interesting, we're doing lots of follow-up experiments on it. I think it's quite a potentially powerful paradigm for asking some quite interesting questions along, if I understand the motivation of the question correctly, along the lines you're thinking. So, for example, in an experiment we've been running this year, and I will say the problem with these experiments is that because you're having to do what the female does to the male, your sample size is number of pairs, not number of individuals, and the courtship feeding season is quite short in Jays. So an experiment usually takes us about 3 years of data to get enough to do one. So it's a bit slow. But one of the things we want to do is have a condition where the food bowl goes in and the male sees that the female has access to the food bowl, but then he doesn't see what happens next. And then having made some assumptions about what she might be doing during that period, he's given other information. For example, he might see the food bowl come out and now it's totally empty. Or he might see the food bowl come out and the worms have been untouched. So we want to look at things like that to see what kind of information he can use and what kind of sort of feedback he can use to make the choices. And obviously I'm interested in the pattern of failures embedded within successes is going to probably be the most useful in terms of telling us what they're doing. If that makes sense.
So I was really interested in the Corvids that were to plan ahead. And I was wondering, I assume you're using adult Corvids at that point? And if you had tested to see what the youngest age of the crows that they could do it, and then also if that corresponded with the time of development. So in humans, that'd be a PSC, hippocampus interaction, the plan ahead. If there's a similar relationship that's developing at that time in the brain of the Corvids that would enable that ability.
It would be lovely to do that. We've done very little developmental work so far, in part because trying to do development in scrub jays is extremely difficult, simply for boring logistical reasons. I now live in Cambridge and wild scrub jays live in California, and trying to get them across at the right time and do all the development and all the licenses is a headache. But we've just got a 5-year ERC grant, and we're part of the ERC grant is to look at development in Eurasian jays. So we're just setting up a program now, obviously it will be for the start of next year, to bring in baby jays and look developmentally at some of these things, because I agree they're fascinating questions. So we don't know yet, but I hope in a couple of years I might have some answers for you.
Yeah, so it's always difficult with negative results, I guess, with the kids to interpret what's going on. With the satiety experiment, is it possible that the children interpret the feeding behaviour of the one they watch on the video as a preference? So have you got the satiety check that you do with the jays so that because kids can eat a lot of crackers, I imagine, and they may think, well, he's eating a lot of crackers, they probably like some more crackers.
Yeah, so Ed did ask them that, and that they weren't very good at that. But we do need to I'd like to find a proper behavioural measure rather than just look at their response to a question. But that one of the things he did ask is, why did you choose that, and is the child full? And they would always answer the is the child full question correctly. So that's a start in the right direction, but I'd like to get some more. It's the first forays into the child development stuff, so there's a few, critical controls that I want to add in due course, but we've just finished the experiment, so I wanted to share the basics.
In the can mummy see experiment, or that's the best thing I can use to describe it,
Yeah.
it strikes me that it's just below directly comparable with the bird experiment in that the children got to play with the goggles, but they didn't do the activity. So your thieves were the ones who then recache. So they've undergone the act of actually thieving, and then they think, oh, well, the birds can thieve, so I'm going to remove my food. Has anybody tried repeating the experiment, giving the kids the goggles, getting them to say, where is the sticker? And then does that affect the results?
Yes. We've done the experiment. Now, for simplicity today, I called it Experiment 1 and Experiment 2, but Experiment 2 is, in actual fact, really Experiment 3. What Experiment 2 really was the experiment you just described. And because we found that when the kids wear the goggles, and then we got them to play the game and have a box-finding task where we put a sticker in one of, I think it was 7 cups, and they had to then either point to the cup it was in or guess which cup it was in if they couldn't see. And to make sure that actually they couldn't guess correctly, we actually didn't literally put the sticker in when the eyes were covered, so it would always be they were right in this condition and wrong in the other condition. And surprisingly, we found it didn't help them. But you're right, it's missing, and it was just for, I thought, which experiment should I take out? So I took out that very one that you're spot on.
This is a different kind of question. I suppose it's someone you've been asking. But have you looked at differences between corvids between different corvid species?
Not very much. But we're starting to. So part of the objective of the ERC grant is to compare the New Caledonian crows that do tools for a living with the rooks and jays that don't. The only one we've done so far is the Essex Fable task, and we found that the New Caledonian crows were no better than the rooks and jays. What I mean by that is that what we found in all three species is if you simply give them the training task, you know, with the metallic thing that flips down, if you give them that and you put some stones in a bowl quite close to the trap, none of them do it, not even the New Caledonian crows that do tools for a living. What you have to do to train them is to actually have a ledge on top of the tube with some stones and some worms. What happens then is the birds see worms and go, ooh, yummy food, or bits of meat in the case of the New Caledonian crows. They land on the platform to get the food. Then with luck, at some point in landing on the tube, they'll knock a stone in, you know, they'll land on it and one will slide in, or they'll nudge one in. Probably by accident. Certainly the most simple explanation would be by accident a stone falls down the tube. Once they've seen a stone fall down the tube, then they start putting stones into the tube. And that's the only one we've compared so far. But we've got a whole series of variants of these tasks and the hook tool ones, which we want to directly compare the ones that don't use tools normally in the wild or reliably in the wild with the New Caledonian crows that seem obsessed with tools, to ask some of those questions. You could do it with lots of other things, but that seemed a simple starting point.
Can I ask a quick question first?
Certainly.
To do with incentive, now, were they, for the water and tube test, were they explicitly, the children, were they explicitly asked to get that sticker out? Or were they just left with the apparatus?
They were asked to get the sticker, and they were told that if they get the sticker, they could exchange it for a big fancy University of Cambridge I'm as clever as a crow badge, which everybody was really motivated with.
Right, okay, so, and you're happy that was a good enough incentive to get the sticker out?
And if they failed, very often they cried.
Right, okay, so
that little boy bawled his head off for about 20 minutes afterwards. One very angry mum, oh dear.
You've shown that crows are really clever, and explain part of that with social intelligence and convergent evolution. I know it's speculative, but it's been pointed out that octopus are very intelligent, or behave intelligently physically, and you've got other oddities like honey badgers showing amazing physical cognition. So I'm really wondering whether the social hypothesis will stand out. And of course, we don't have data yet.
Yes, absolutely. And I ran some experiments with one of my colleagues in France, actually, and we found that the giant squid can do the what, where, when task, interestingly. But, you know, they're solitary, so what's that about? And yes, I mean, at the moment, we really don't know. And it's a there's so many factors that could be involved, so I agree. It's not it's just a helpful segue in for the purposes of my argument, rather than it being, I'm claiming that that's why they've evolved this way. And if it is physical, then we'd want to know what it is about the physical environments that have promoted these things, or is there something else?
Just for the purpose of time, we'll stop it there, but I'd like to thank you again for giving us a talk tonight.